Thanks for joining me on episode 374 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
My name is Show Adiemi. I'm a Christian financial advisor. I'm the host of the Dollar Savvy podcast. And I challenge you to invest in yourself, invest in others, develop your influence, impact the world by using your time, your talents, and your treasures to live out your calling. Find your path to financial freedom. And one way to be inspired to do that is to listen to my friend, Scott Mater, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
The truth is that often the people that know you the best have the hardest time listening to advice from you. They have the hardest time hearing your message. They have the hardest time buying in. So sometimes the people that you love the most are actually the ones that are the hardest to convince to get behind you on your dream, especially if that dream is risky and hard.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about impacting the world through stewarding your talent, I talk with you about why what you do every day affects your impact, why local is easier and harder, and why global reach is possible if you start local.
You've heard me talk about developing your talent, and one of the best ways to do that is through books. But if you're like most people today, it's hard to find the time to read. And that's why today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Go to inspiredstewardship.com/audible to sign up, and you can get a 30-day free trial. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from, and you can pick one and listen your way to developing your talents via Audible. That's inspiredstewardship.com/audible to get your free trial and listen to great books the same way you're listening to this podcast.
You've probably heard at some point in your life the poem attributed to an unknown author from something like 1100 AD called I Wanted to Change the World. If you haven't heard it, it goes like this. When I was a young man, I wanted to change the world. I found it was difficult to change the world, so I tried to change my nation. When I found I couldn't change the nation, I began to focus on my town. I couldn't change my town, and as an older man, I tried to change my family. Now, as a very old man, I realize the only thing I can change is myself. And suddenly I realized that if long ago I had changed myself, I could have made an impact on my family. My family and I could have made an impact on our town. Their impact could have changed the nation. And indeed, I could have changed the world. You know, one of the things that happens when we talk about impact, I've talked before about how so often we get wrapped up in this idea of impact is only important when it's big. You know, if I don't have 1,000 followers, then it's not big enough. If I don't have 10 million followers, then it's not big enough. If I haven't reached the whole planet, then it's not big enough. And the truth is that that's not really the way to measure impact. That's not how God looks at impact. That's not how we should look at impact. Impact is not about the 99. It's about the one. So what you do each and every day affects the impact that you have. It's the ability to get up every day and try again and push a little harder and do a little more and do that day in and day out, even on the days when it's not working, and even on the days where it's frustrating, even on the days where things just don't seem to actually have any sort of effect. It's doing and being consistent and doing over and over the little things, growing yourself, building yourself up, serving others, and taking care of others. Doing that day in and day out with consistency actually creates a bigger impact. That's why that poem talks about if I changed myself, then I would have had a global impact. That's the key, to start there. And when you think about that, when you think about this and you go one step further, you hear this idea of local effects to create a global change. And the truth is that when you look at your local, when you look at what's right around you, when you look at your family, your friends, your church, your business, whatever, it's both easier and harder to work on making an impact there. It's easier because it's close to you. You know it well. But it's also harder for the exact same reason. The truth is that often the people that know you the best have the hardest time listening to advice from you. They have the hardest time hearing your message. They have the hardest time buying in. So sometimes the people that you love the most are actually the ones that are the hardest to convince to get behind you on your dream, especially if that dream is risky and hard. It's easier because they're there, but it's harder because they know you. They're close to you. They love you. They care for you. They don't want to see you get hurt. And often that protectionism actually ends up making it harder to make a change. But the truth is, if you work on yourself and you work on changing yourself and you don't worry about fixing others or changing others, and instead you just work on serving and loving and caring for others, it is indeed possible to have a global impact, even with something small. This podcast doesn't have millions of listeners, but it has slowly grown over time. And I looked the other day, and there's currently downloads and listeners in 20-something countries. And that's amazing to me. I wouldn't be able to reach listeners in those other places except for the world that we live in. And the fact that reach happens is not because of I set out to do it. I didn't target to get downloads from the UK or from anywhere else in the world, from Sweden, from France, from Spain. In fact, when I started this podcast, I wasn't sure that there'd be anybody listening. But now there's hundreds and hundreds of people listening in dozens of countries around the world. The global reach happens because I started first on myself and growing myself and serving others. I started local to have a global reach. That's what you have to do yourself. You have to start by growing yourself, then by serving others. And through doing that, over time, you can grow a global audience. But oftentimes, if you set out to grow a global audience, if that's really kind of your one and only mission, then what's funny is it actually becomes harder to do it because you're so focused on that outcome that becomes the driving force. Instead of serving others, the driving force becomes, do I get more listeners? Do I get more audience? Do I grow more reach? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wanting to help more people and reach more people and serve more people. That's a noble thing, assuming that's your intention. And it's coming out of a noble spirit. It's coming out of the idea of really trying to help others. That's a good thing then. But the truth is that all too often, what happens instead is we become focused on the end of how it serves us instead of the means of serving others. So turn it around. Look first at what can you do to grow yourself? What can you do to help influence the circle that's right around you and make an impact on them? And through doing that, I think you'll find that you will indeed impact the world. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of talent, you can go over to inspiredstewardship.com/talent and sign up for our 5-week series on the stewardship of talent. Or if you're in the U.S., you can text 44222 talent tips. That's talent tips to 44222 and get those tips. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.